All right, so I'm back. So now let's continue our discussion. All right. So where we are, we just introduced this aggregate demand curve. Right. So this aggregate demand curve stays lower the price, higher the aggregate demand. Okay. So now we need to understand what caused this aggregate demand curve present a downward sloping. Right. So just remind yourself the GDP equal to C plus I plus G plus net export, right? So essentially, they just look at GDP through expenditure. As I just mentioned before the short break, we say there are three ways to look at GDP, and expenditure essentially just think about look at GDP through demand. Okay? Now the question is, why does the rise in aggregate price level reduce CI and NEC, which is net export? And here, so we just essentially exclude the G. Okay, so we simplify our discussion. Says G is going to independent of price level, right? If we understand, so the aggregate price level reduce CI or NX, and then we understand why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards. So there are two reasons. First is a wealth effect. What is the wealth effect? Higher aggregate price reduce purchasing power of the households, right? Just imagine if you have, let's say, if you have 10,000 deposit, so that's all your wealth. Okay. Now, say for example, suddenly, so the price level increase, or we have an inflation of 100%. So that just immediately means overnight your purchasing power will cut by half. And then, so you must reduce your consumer spending, right? Because you cannot afford what was affordable yesterday. Okay, so this is a wealth effect. So the higher price is going to reduce your net wealth. That's going to force you to reduce your consumer spending as a response to a reduced purchasing power. On the other hand, there's an interest effect. Okay, so there are many ways to understand that. So one way to look at is higher aggregate price requires you to hold more money for transaction. Okay, and that's going to lead to a further rise in interest rate. Okay, the rise in interest rate is going to lead you to cut your investment spending. Okay? You may also want to cut your consumer spending. So a higher interest rate leads to falls in investment spending is straightforward, particularly by looking at mortgage. But why a higher interest rate leads to reduced consumer spending? Right? This is essentially just says if I postpone my consumer spending or delay my consumer spending, actually I can afford more. Just give you an example, $1. Okay, so if the price of the bottled water is $1, meaning so today if you just consume this $1 today, immediately you get one bottle of water. Now let's just say if the interest rate increase from 50% to 100%. Okay, meaning so now you can afford 2 bottled waters if you postpone your purchase instead of 1.5 bottled waters. Right? So where this 1.5 coming from? This is when the interest rate is 50%. 50% interest rate is going to give you $1.5 tomorrow if you postpone your purchase. And a 100% interest rate is going to give you $2 if you postpone your purchase. Right? So if you postpone your purchase to tomorrow, and if it's under 50% of interest rate, you get 1.5 bottled water. Under 100% of interest rate, you get 2 bottled water. Now, and from here, clearly you can see the higher the interest rate, you're more willingness to postpone your purchase because you're going to get more. Right? But where does this rising interest rate coming from? Coming from higher price level, and households must hold more cash. If households hold more cash, meaning so there are less money available in deposit in the bank. Okay, so in that sense, the interest rate must go up to attract the households put money in the bank. Right? So this wealth effect and interest rate effect leads to consumer spending or investment spending decline with higher price level. Right? Or explain why the aggregate demand curve is downward slope. Right? So we can use this income expenditure model we discussed in previous chapter to understand why the aggregate demand is a downward slope, or why price level decrease leads to total aggregate expenditure increase, or if price increase leads to Y decrease. Here I may want to put a Y star. Right? So let's just look at the income expenditure model we just concluded. So in this income expenditure model, we take price as given. Given price, we can see the aggregate expenditure line cross 45-degree line. That's going to give us the Y star, or the equilibrium aggregate expenditure. But this equilibrium is under the income expenditure model with P given. So now if there's a change in price level, or we drop the assumption that price is fixed, okay? So just think about, if there is a decline in price level, right? Like here. So if there's decline in price, and then because of the wealth effect and income and interest rate effect, so the C and I will increase. Why? Because if the price decline leads to your purchasing power to increase, and then your C increase. P decrease is going to lead to interest rate in decrease. That leads to I increase. Right? So this curve is going to shift up. Now this curve shift up, and then so we are going to see a new Y star. Right? Or Y star change from Y1 to Y2. Or in other words, when price decline, and then so you're going to see Y increase, right? And then we can put everything together by looking at these two diagrams. Okay, so on the top, so that's the income expenditure model we have discussed. But this is for given level price, right? So given level price on the top. So if the price equal to P1, we look at the top diagram. So you find out the real GDP equal to Y1. Now, if the price level decline, and then so because of the wealth effect and the income effect, we just look at the aggregate planned expenditure will go up, and the real GDP will go up. Okay, so go to Y2, and then so we put in this diagram in the bottom a new point, right? So when price decline, the aggregate expenditure plan go up, and we reach a new equilibrium of Y2. So and then so here reflects the Y2 increase, right? So this is our aggregate demand. So we can look at this one more time. Okay? So on the top is for a given price. Okay, for any price, you're going to find out a y, right? And then so we just plot this y versus given price in the bottom. So that's given by this point. Now we look at a different price. And we look at different price. And then so you find out that's going to correspond to a different y on the bottom, on the top. So we just plot the combination in the bottom. Okay, and these two dots is going to give us the aggregate demand curve. It is a downward sloping line that reflects price is going to have wealth effect and income interest rate effect on individuals' aggregate expenditure. Okay, so given this aggregate demand curve, we may ask our questions. What happened when something changed spending pattern at every price level? Okay, so that just means the demand curve will shift. Okay? So this shift can cause by expectation, can cause by wealth, or caused by the size of existing stock or physical capital. And it also can cause by government policies. Okay? So start with expectation. Tomorrow is going to be our election day. Okay? Depending on your expectation, or depending on the economic expectation. Okay? So we are going to have an outlook regarding to future economy. Okay? It could be a booming economy in front of us. It could be a recession in front of us. I mean, in terms of expectation. Okay? So this expectation is going to feed back to our demand curve. Right? So for example, if we are expecting a booming economy, and then so we are going to increase our consumption and increase our investment spending as a response to a very rosy expectation. Right? So that's going to lift off the aggregate demand curve, or the aggregate demand curve will shift off. So this is expectation. Okay, wealth. Okay, for some reason, if the aggregate wealth of the economy increase, okay, and then so we may increase our consumption and investment altogether, right? So now the third impact coming from the side of existing stock of physical capital. So that's largely affect the business. Okay, if we have too many physical capital, and even worse, a fraction of them are in idle, that they are not functioning. Just think about the restaurant, right? So they are 50% open. Okay? If that's the case, that's going to affect investment. If you already have a lot of idle capital, why would you want to do investment? So that doesn't make much sense, right? So those are the facts. All right. So the last sense is government policy, right, including fiscal policy and monetary policy, right? Let's just look at fiscal policy. Okay, so you do not know what is fiscal policy yet. I haven't explained to you what is fiscal policy yet. Okay, let me just give you an example. Okay, if we know the government is going to cut the tax, so essentially that just make our income, disposable income increase in the future. So that is going to lift up aggregate demand as well. Okay, because you have more to spend in the future. All right? Okay, so those are the factors can cause the aggregate demand curve shift. Okay. There are two different types of shift. Either the right word, or you can think about up, lift up. Right? So this is increase in aggregate demand. How we understand that? It just says for any level of price, you're going to see a higher level of demand or real GDP. Remember, so this is, we look at expenditure from demand side. Okay? On the other hand, if the curve shifts to the left, or you may think was moved down, right? And then so this is a decrease. The way we understand that is for any level of price, the real GDP decline or the aggregate expenditure reduce. Right? So this is a shift of aggregate demand curve. It will be caused by changes in expectation, changes in wealth, changes in physical capital, changes in government policy. Okay, so in reality, sometimes it can be difficult to differentiate between move along the curve or shift the curve, right? And particularly, so when we observe a change in wealth, okay? So a change in wealth can cause move along the curve. It can also cause shift the curve. To answer to that, whether a change in wealth cause us move along the curve or cause shift the curve, will depend on the source of changing wealth. Okay? So if a change is in price level that cause change in wealth, and then so that's going to be a move along the aggregate demand, because there's nothing affect the fundamental of the economy, right? On the other hand, if there's something else change that affect our wealth, say for example, there's a housing market crash or housing market boom, so that is going to shift the aggregate demand. Okay, so summarize whether a change in wealth will cause us to move along the aggregate demand or will lead to a demand curve to shift. It largely depending on the source of change in wealth. If the change in wealth coming from, say for example, inflation or deflation, okay, so we will stick with the original aggregate demand curve, which is the move along the curve. On the other hand, okay, if the wealth change coming from other than price level, right? Say for example, so the housing value gains, right? Or we lose value in housing market. So in that sense, or in that case, we are going to see the aggregate demand curve to shift. Okay. Now we can look at these practice questions. So if the economy is in equilibrium and the real estate market collapse, what will likely happen? So this just exactly reflects what we just discussed. Housing market collapse leads wealth to decline. And then so you want to cut your spending. So the aggregate demand curve will shift to left. Right? By the way, here SRAS stands for short run aggregate supply. So this is what we are going to discuss in the following slides. Right? So the answer is B. All right, so now we are ready to look at aggregate supply. Okay, so we have just finished discussion for aggregate demand. Now we move to the other side of the market. So we look at supply. Again, so I want to emphasize we can look at GDP through three ways. Okay, so one, expenditure, that corresponds to demand. In the other ways, look at the product, that corresponds to supply. And in the middle, we can look at income. Okay? So we just look at demand, so now we are going to look at supply. Right? And similarly, so we are going to look at aggregate supply curve by plotting real GDP measured by product versus aggregate price level. Right? And then, so with no surprise, we are going to see an upward slope aggregate supply curve. higher the price increase leads to output increase or Y increase. Okay, but here, very interestingly, so the reason why this upward slope is different from what we've seen from in micro, or a little bit more subtle. Okay, now we need to understand why the aggregate supply curve is upward slope. And here, so we start with short run. Okay, so this upward slope aggregate supply curve only holds in short run. You may wondering how we define short run, and then later we are going to see long run. How we differentiate between short run and long run. And then the answer to that is a little bit interesting. Right? So basically, we differentiate short run versus long run by looking at whether this relationship holds or not. If this upward slope trend between price and the supply or the GDP holds, and then so we are in the short run, otherwise we are in long run, right? So we will come back down later. So for now, let's just focus on short run aggregate supply, and I'm going to explain to you why in the short run, higher price leads to higher GDP. Right? So the answer coming from sticky wage, like this background picture shows something is sticky. Okay, and here what is sticky in our economy is wage, and the nominal wage is sticky. Okay. So what is nominal wage? Nominal wage is a dollar amount of the wage paid. Okay. I understand some students have a job, either as a part-time or full-time, right? So whether you have full-time job or part-time job, so your job typically going to pay you some wage, right? And this wage is nominal in the sense, so the wage is specify how much money you're going to receive. So in that sense, it's nominal. And so this wage is sticky in the sense your nominal wage is fixed for a given amount. Typically, so you may have a wage rate for 6 months, maybe 1 year, right? So what that means is once you agree to work for your employer, or once your employer decide to extend an offer to you, so both of you will agree. So you're going to work for the business at that wage, and this wage will be good for a certain amount of time, like 6 months or a week or a year, right? And so typically, so this wage is binding, okay? And so this is not going to adjust with the aggregate economy, right? Okay, so this is sticky wage. This sticky wage is going to generate the upward slope aggregate supply curve as we've seen in the previous slides. Now I need to explain to you why this sticky wage is going to cause an upward short run aggregate supply. Right. So to answer that, so we need to look at a slightly separate question or intermediate questions. How does sticky wage affect profit? Right. So this is an intermediate question. Eventually, we are going to see how does sticky wage affect short run aggregate supply. Okay? And so we look at intermediate object, which is profit of business. So profit of the business, or profit per unit of the business, equal to price per unit minus production cost per unit. Okay? Just think about if you work for McDonald's or Five Guys. Okay? And just imagine, so your job, you just flip the burger, right? And then, so for the business or for owners of Five Guys, So what they care is the profit per unit. And in that particular case, it's a profit per burger sold. And the profit per burger sold equal to price of that burger. So for example, like $10 minus production cost per burger. So that includes two parts. One is the material, like buns, like the meat, okay? And so on and so forth. The other cost is the labor cost. I would say labor cost is probably more than 50% of the cost. Okay? Now just imagine if there's a price change. Let's say if there's increase in price, right? And then, so how would that affect the profit per burger you sold? Okay, so first, the price of the burger will increase, right? So this is going to increase. But the cost of the burger will increase as well because the material becomes more expensive. So if there's no labor cost, and then so the increase in material, the cost increase in material maybe offset the increase in price per burger. You may end up with break even, right? But however, a big chunk of cost coming from labor. And interestingly, in the short run, because of the labor contract is binding, because the employee agreed to work for certain nominal wage, and the employer, so they are free to hire these individuals at that price. What that means is, yes, we have an increase in aggregate price. So the price of the burger you sold will increase, the material you purchase will increase, but you save some money by paying a fixed wage or sticky wage. So that means the price increase actually becomes a good news for you, because now per burger you sold, you're going to make more profit. And most of the profit coming from a sticky wage, right? Okay, so given a higher price leads to higher profit. And then the business will respond by expanding their operation, or naturally, so they're going to produce more. Why they want to produce more? Because for each burger they are going to sell, more profit will be made, right? So that explains why aggregate supply will increase with price increase. Okay, so again, this is in short run. And the reason why I emphasize this is in the short run, now you may wondering, so what would happen in the long run? Okay, so in the short run, so the wage is fixed. If you work for Five Guys or for whoever discussed in this example, okay? Okay, and so now there's a price change. In the short run, there's nothing you can do. But certainly you're going to suffer, right? Why? Because the higher price is going to lead to lower real wage. In the sense, the money wage you paid is going to pay you less, or it's going to buy you less in the market, right? And yes, in the short run, you have a binding wage, you can't do much. But over time, so you may wondering, does that make sense for me to keep working for this business? Does that make sense, or is that fair for my employer pay me the same wage? What I can do, right? So those are the questions will pop up in your mind. right? And naturally, so you either bargain for higher wage or you walk away, you find alternative business who is willing to pay you a higher wage, right? And then, so that is going to affect the business decision. Why? Because over time, so the business must raise the wage. Otherwise, they are going to lose their employees, right? Otherwise, they cannot make the profit they can at the beginning. Okay, so you can see over the long term, so there's going to have adjustment. The profit will decline. So the increase in decline only happens in the short run because the wage is sticky. But over time, the wage will adjust. Right? So I'm going to stop here. So we are going to see how this adjustment happens and how would that affect aggregate supply in the mid-term and long term. Thank you so much for your attention and see you on Wednesday.